Good morning and welcome back to the second day of our conference on religion and human rights, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to Dignitatis Humanae. Today we will have two panels, and I am delighted to welcome my co-teacher, colleague, partner in crime, co-author, Amy Ullman, who is a lecturer at the Law Center, who will be the moderator for today's panel. So we're delighted to have this esteemed panel. Amy.
Great, so thank you. And I was just chatting with one of our students. Thank you for the early rise for the students who are here at 9:30 in the morning, the crack of dawn. And I know this has been an amazing conversation so far, and we have an incredible panel, really just a richness of traditions to explore. And so we're looking forward not only to the 6-minute snapshots of vast centuries of religious traditions in a very quick bite, but especially to the possibility that our panelists will have to interact with each other. And so I know yesterday there were reflections on the Catholic tradition and the big turning point in the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church's openness and capacity to engage with the human rights tradition. And this morning we're going to build on another dimension of that turning point, which is also the openness to engage in a much deeper and more substantial way with the religious traditions of the world on these incredibly important questions of our time for human rights. Particularly the document Nostra Aetate opened up that capacity and that possibility. And so we're also here with gratitude to that openness. And so we're going to give each of our panelists 6 minutes and 30 seconds, more or less. And so I'll introduce each one as they speak. And so just to give you a little bit of a snapshot. So we're going to start with Professor Nader Hashemi, who's a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's an expert in Islam and politics, and his books include Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. And so we're very, very glad to welcome you and to hear your thoughts.
Can I use the podium?
Sure, yeah, as you're comfortable.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Just a quick update on my bio. I'm now here at Georgetown. This is my second year. I was at Denver for 15 wonderful years. And the other sort of introductory remark I want to make is that I'm here primarily because I heard that David Little and Jose Casanova are attending the conference, and I've been deeply influenced by their work, and so it's a huge honor to be at a conference with them. So when future intellectual historians look back on the late 20th and 21st centuries, the debate on Islam and human rights will feature quite prominently. The reasons for this are not difficult to discern. This debate overlaps with several important themes, events, and controversies that have shaped the political and moral landscape of our world over the last 50 years. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, the mainstreaming of political Islam in the Middle East, the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict, the Salman Rushdie affair, the Danish cartoon controversy, the rise, fall, and now return of the Taliban, debates over multiculturalism and secularism in different parts of the world and reasonable accommodation, 9/11, the Iraq War, the rise of ISIS, the rise of global authoritarianism, etc. In all of these cases, Islam, Muslims, and human rights were part of these debates, sometimes at the center of these debates. Now, looking back, it's difficult to locate the intellectual origins of the debate on Islam and human rights with precision. Until the late 1970s, the subject rarely came up. In the early years of the United Nations, there was little controversy. When the UN Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, along with its two subsequent covenants, Muslim states participated in and were broadly supportive of these documents. Muslims participated and played important roles in drafting and discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They discussed the primacy of individual rights versus the authority of the state, women's rights in marriage, and religious freedom. They not only played an important role in moving these nascent human rights projects forward, but they've also contributed to universalizing these newly defined norms of human rights as documented by scholars such as Elizabeth Ann Meyer. Shaista Ikramullah was a member of the Third Committee, a Pakistani delegate with Eleanor Roosevelt. They were the only two women, and she was the sole Muslim to have played a role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She took a strong interest in the formulation of Article 16, which explicitly championed equal rights for women and men in marriage. Ambassador Ikramullah later said that it was imperative that the peoples of the world should recognize that the existence of a code of civilized behavior should apply not only in international relations, but also in domestic affairs. She was a pioneering female human rights thinker in an era of global male chauvinism, and she later became member of the drafting of the UN Convention on the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And she noted with great sorrow that when she was part of the discussion, the theme of cultural genocide was removed from the document. It would have certainly helped populations today suffering from cultural genocide, specifically the Uyghurs. Ikramullah later observed that there were Western nations who believed that the draft declaration of the UN Human Rights Declaration went too far. South Africa fell into this category, and some Western nations, following the Anglo-American lead, believed that the focus should be exclusively on individual rights and not the responsibilities of the state toward its citizens. Ideological divisions were starting to emerge between the West and the Soviet Union. Few scholars who study the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are actually familiar with her, and she's been largely relegated to the margins of history, including in Muslim societies. She also played a key role in trying to push for more gender-neutral language in the final text of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, preferring the term all human beings instead of the term mankind, which is what Eleanor Roosevelt was fine with. Saudi Arabia abstained from the final vote at the UN Declaration of Human Rights in the General Assembly, but according to scholarship by scholars such as Susan Waltz, Muslim states made important and substantive contributions to all of the three foundational UN documents on human rights. While some objections were raised by Muslim delegates on the question of women's equality and the right to change religion, none of these objections prevented Muslim states from formally endorsing international standards for human rights. And this was clearly reflected in the 1972 Charter of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where all Muslim states were a member. The preamble of this charter that was ratified in 1974 invokes the UN Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights as sort of key foundational documents. But you start to see a change coming in as you get to the end of the 20th century, when provisions for human rights in Muslim societies were then qualified by the argument that they had to be in compliance with Sharia, Islamic law. And there you start to get controversy and great debate. So how do we explain this? I think two factors come in. Muslim ruling elites sought to perpetuate their authoritarian rule by manipulating religion in the service of political power. This is ongoing. At the level of society, Islamist opposition groups were using identity politics to demand a rewriting of laws to conform with a new understanding of what constituted Islamic authenticity. Some of the key areas of tension that still remain in the debate on Islam and human rights revolve around questions primarily with respect to the full legal equality of women across the board without restriction, questions of apostasy and freedom of speech, and the limitations that should occur in the context of concerns regarding blasphemy. Now, the good news is that there's now a robust literature on the relationship between Islam and human rights. It's been excessively developed, argued. It exists. But the point that I want to sort of make here in the end is that the political context and the moral context in which these debates are playing out are very negatively predisposed for the advancement of human rights in Muslim societies, largely because we're talking about Muslim majority societies that are living in authoritarian contexts, in contexts where there's mass poverty, mass pauperization, Many of these states are torture states, repressive states. Some of them backed by the West, and that creates a big problem for many Muslim activists, specifically when you have many Western countries that claim to uphold human rights, doing the exact opposite when it comes to advancing their national interests in different parts of the world. The obvious example right now is what's happening in Gaza, where the United States champions human rights, at least the Biden administration does, very vociferously in the context of Eastern Europe, but has the exact opposite policy when it comes to the human rights of the Palestinians. I'll just end by saying that one of the key contributions of human rights that's largely been unrecognized, and this is really a test for everyone in the audience, is the role that Muslim women activists are playing. In the last 20 years, 4 Muslim women have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Prize to anyone who can name their names. I asked my students, they couldn't do it. One student came up with 2 names, but this gives you a sense at how the engine for human rights advancement in Muslim majority societies today is really not at the level of theory or philosophy, but of activism, fighting against repressive states to advance the cause of human rights. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much. And now we'll welcome Rabbi David Saperstein, who has served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom and was the first chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And he's currently with our Center for Jewish Civilization here at Georgetown with the School of Foreign Service. And he is well known for his service as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and his work in heading national religious coalitions. He's a fellow attorney, and he's taught for over 30 years at Georgetown's Law Center, First Amendment law and Jewish law. So David, we're delighted to have you here. Thanks.
I'm also going to use the platform as a good example, getting everything in a short period of time. So I actually was asked to address 2 different topics in my 6 minutes. Let me give it a whirl here. First, is Judaism's perspective on human rights. It's interesting that there is no term in classical Hebrew for rights. It is a system of responsibilities. So it's not just that a right passively exists. It has to be actualized by the society, the end result of what a claim to rights would be. Also no term for equality per se, although famously and pivotally on this, there is a whole range of proto-democratic, proto-human rights ideas that animate the Jewish tradition. You shall have one law for the stranger and the citizen alike. For I, the Eternal, am your God, in Leviticus. It says in different ways that idea has been resonant in Jewish thought. Secondly, the infinite value of every human being, rooted in the belief that we are all created in a divine image, that all of us have the spark of the divine. And this applies not just to Jews, but to all people, all who are linked to my name, whom I have created, formed, and make my glory. Isaiah. In the early medieval times, one of the authorities wrote, I call on heaven and earth to witness whether one be Gentile or Jew, man or woman, slave or free. The divine spirit rests on each in accordance with his or her deeds. The fundamental equality of all people that flows from that, from the interpretations of the Bible that ask, why were we all descended from one couple in the stories of the Bible? Or why was Adam made from the dust of the 4 corners and the 4 colors of the earth? So that none of us could claim that the merit of our ancestors was greater than anyone else's. We are all equal before God, all truly brothers and sisters. The rule of law, to which even the highest human ruler was held accountable. It was true in terms of civil, I have to put aside religious law, but in terms of civil and criminal law, men and women all were treated equally. And when Nathan the prophet confronts David over the incident with Bathsheba and says, thou art the one, and God holds you responsible, when Elijah condemns and confronts Ahab over Naboth's vineyard, the principle of the rule of law over nations and kings is set forth unmistakably. The institution of the rabbi itself, the abandonment element of the priestly structure at the center of Jewish life. It was a meritocracy. Anyone could become a rabbi, at least for much of Jewish history. Any male could be one. Every male was educated. I hear from the time of the Talmud, nearly 2,000 years ago, until today, there was a public school system that every Jewish child, rich and poor alike, in the law is explicit about that, were able to go to. And in point of fact, the rabbi has no role in any kind of hierarchy in society. There is nothing that a rabbi can do that any other Jews can't do, again, in traditional Judaism, Jewish males, today in liberal streams, non-Jewish, non-males as well. Here, indeed, the only thing a rabbi can do that nobody else can do is the only thing a PhD can do that nobody else can do, and that's ordain another PhD here. But otherwise, all are treated equally in these regards, and an idea of international law as well. I mean, think of the famous words of Micah, before they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. In the end of days, it shall come to pass. The end of days in the Bible is not a way off mystical supernatural order, but over the horizon. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the eternal, for the law shall go forth from Zion, the word of the eternal from Jerusalem, and God shall judge among many peoples and rebuke among nations afar off. There would be nation states, even in Messianic times, that the Bible envisioned, but they would all be judged by the one law. And when that happened, then the swords could be beaten into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks. All of this animated all of Jewish history, and when the emancipation brought the idea of fundamental rights that evolved into human rights, it was widely embraced for Jews, both because it was resonant with the values of the tradition and had to do with their welfare. For the first time, there was a promise that Jews, the quintessential victims of religious persecution and discrimination throughout human history, might finally have the ability to have equal rights with others. It's perhaps no coincidence that the key author of the Universal Declaration, who served as Eleanor Roosevelt's vice chair, did the first draft and a lot of the fine-tuning of the final draft, René Cassin, a French Jew, he said, he wrote, Jewish conscience in today's world cannot turn away from any act of injustice, from any violent expression of the spirit of intolerance, nor from any case implying that an individual is subject to any arbitrary or oppressive society. The Jewish conscience calls upon each to continue the struggle for freedom of all, to not accept any compromise in the name of national or ideological principle. Or as he declared in his 68th speech in Jerusalem, never will Jews in particular obtain real equality until the totality of human rights are respected for everyone. No group is safe if any group can face persecution. Human rights have to be accessible and applicable to all. And if that is true with Jews, it is also integrally related with the interaction between religious freedom and broader human rights. If you do not have freedom of speech, you do not have freedom of speech for religious entities, either freedom ranging from freedom of the pulpit to freedom to proselytize. If you do not have freedom of press and publication, here you can't publish your sacred texts. You can communicate with your own members. If you don't have a freedom of assembly and association, here then much of religious life is torn apart. And can fail to function. So Articles 18, 19, 20, 20 is assembly and association, all of those in the Universal Declaration are absolutely indispensable to religious freedom as well. So it has to address both the interaction of religious freedom and human rights and what Judaism has to say. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Another miracle of several centuries. It's a great overview. We really appreciate it. And now we'd like to invite Professor Erin Klein, who's here at Georgetown as a distinguished professor in interfaith studies and dialogue, and she's also senior research fellow at the Berkley Center. Her specialization is in Chinese philosophy, Chinese religions, comparative philosophy, theology, and Ignatian spirituality. And her books include Little Sprouts, The Tao of Parenting, Ancient Chinese Philosophy, and the Art of Raising Mindful, Resilient, and Compassionate Kids. When I saw that, I was like, I'm going to run out and buy that book. Beautiful. And so here, too, we've asked Erin to cover 7 major religions in 6 minutes. So thank you.
So, I have been asked to do 2 things this morning. Discuss the contributions of Asian and Southeast Asian religions to advancing human rights and human rights discourse, and to keep my remarks to 6 to 8 minutes. But since all the other speakers at this conference were asked to discuss one religion, and I was asked to cover an entire continent, a continent that is home to 7 major religious traditions, I think the organizers must have meant to give me 6 to 8 minutes per religion. That means I get 40 to 50 minutes, so that's what I'll take. Just kidding. But out of respect for the many different religions and cultures that I'm representing, a respect that I know our conference organizers share, I will speak a bit longer than my allotted time. For weeks after being asked to speak at this conference, I thought about this task and how to best approach it. One of the greatest accidents in my training as a graduate student was that my primary advisor in Chinese philosophy was absent during my first year of graduate school, and as a result, I worked with a professor who specialized in Indian philosophy. This professor attempted to convince me to change my specialization from Chinese philosophy to Indian philosophy, and insisted that all of my coursework that year focus on the Indian tradition. Although this frustrated me tremendously at the time, and although he did not ultimately succeed in convincing me to change my area of specialization, I received significant graduate level training in Indian philosophies and religions, and that has been a tremendous asset. My training that year focused not just on Hinduism, but on the 6 different and distinct orthodox darshanas, or schools of Hinduism, which accept the authority of the sacred hymns known as the Vedas, as well as the heterodox schools of thought, which do not, including Jainism, several distinct branches of Buddhism, and the Charvak, Tantric, and Sikh traditions. This has given me a unique perspective on Asian religions, one that is broader than most of my peers in the field of Chinese philosophy and religion. While I am by no means an expert in South Asian religions, I did have the opportunity to study them enough to grasp their incredible diversity, full of debate and disagreement over wide-ranging topics throughout history. This diversity makes them much like the East Asian traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, Moism, Yangism, the Shinto tradition, East Asian forms of Buddhism, and the large and amorphous category of syncretic Chinese religion, sometimes called folk religion or popular religion. Yet the religions of South Asia and East Asia didn't develop as a response to common sources or as a response to each other, and did not have contact until Buddhism entered China in the 1st century. Even then, with the exception of the distinctive forms of Buddhism that developed in China, Korea, Japan, and in Southeast Asia, they evolved largely independently of one another. These are some of the reasons why it's problematic to try to talk about Asian religions as a whole. So for me, the question, how can I describe the contributions to human rights by so many diverse religions in such a vast swath of the world? If I narrow it down to the largest and most influential traditions, I am still left with the Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist, Hindu, Jain, Sikh, and Shinto traditions. Which tradition and which branch within any one of those should be my focus? The achievements and contributions relating to human rights in Asia have been vast and extensive over the past 75 years, resulting in several Nobel Peace Prizes. Indeed, earlier this month, the Nobel Peace Prize recognized the work of Nihon Hidankyo, the Japanese grassroots organization created by survivors of the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Other Nobel Peace Prizes have recognized Eisaku Sato in 1974, whose views concerning human rights motivated his work to bring Japan into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the work of the 14th Dalai Lama in 1989 in the struggle for human rights in Tibet and China. Then there is the work of Kim Dae-jung, whose work on human rights in South Korea and East Asia earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2000 and reminds us of the ongoing political repression and human rights abuses in North Korea. There is Liu Xiaobo's long and nonviolent struggle for human rights in China, recognized in 2010. And then there is the complicated story of Aung San Suu Kyi's nonviolent struggle for human rights in Myanmar and the serious questions about her subsequent involvement in the Myanmar military's role in the Rohingya genocide and the prosecution of journalists. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there were numerous books published in my field of Chinese philosophy and religion focused on Confucianism and human rights. Many scholars of Confucianism questioned whether conceptions of human rights are helpful in the dialogue with the East Asian and Southeast Asian cultures that are influenced by Confucianism, since Confucian views take human relationships as central to our identities, and such views contrast readily with more individualistic views of the human person that ground human rights. But in recent years, my colleague David Hollenbach has argued convincingly, I think, that human rights need not and should not be understood individualistically. He has argued that human rights guarantee participation in human community, enabling people to make contributions to their communities. We undoubtedly see examples of this in the work of all of the Nobel Peace Prize winners I've mentioned, who grew up in cultures informed by Confucian values, and yet who devoted their lives to working for human rights. This helps to confirm what Steve Engel and Maria Svensson argued in their important 2001 book, The Chinese Human Rights Reader. Chinese rights discourse shows a complex interaction between people discovering and interpreting foreign ideas that they take to be of universal significance, on the one hand, and people building from a foundation of native terms and concerns, on the other. I believe this is true of other Asian religions and cultures as well. In my own work on Confucianism and human dignity, I argue that for many Confucian thinkers, the real source of human dignity or worth lies in our moral potential. The Confucian concern with the early moral development of infants and young children demonstrates that many Confucians believed our moral potential exists right from the start, and that our lives have some measure of inherent or intrinsic value. Indeed, a number of early Confucians believed that our moral potential existed and could be nurtured prior to birth. In my work on disability in the early Taoist tradition, I extend this argument to Taoism, demonstrating that in the proto-Taoist sources from the 4th century BCE, which eventually become a formal part of the Taoist canon, we find the earliest known views affirming the value of the lives of those with wide-ranging disabilities and diseases. These sources push back strongly against attempts to eliminate those with differences in disabilities from human communities or to view them as objects of compassion or in need of healing. Instead, they are believed to have a clearer perspective on life and the world as a result of their disabilities. Such views, I argue, would support a variety of restrictions on such things as abortion or the death penalty. All of these thinkers recognize, even in the absence of a conception of God, what is central to conceptions of human dignity and human rights in monotheistic religions, that human lives have value regardless of whether we think their potential has been fully realized, and that we ought to treat people accordingly. Yet a conception of human dignity is not explicitly employed in early Confucian or Taoism. Even though these texts clearly express the view that human lives have value, there was no exact correlate in these traditions to the view that human life has absolute value, which has traditionally grounded the claim that human beings have certain inalienable rights. This, I believe, is genuinely one of the most remarkable and distinctive contributions of Abrahamic faith traditions to our world today. There are, however, areas in which traditions like Confucianism innovate ideas that only develop later in the West, and these ideas can help point the way toward the future. A current student in my Chinese philosophy class, who happens to be here today, Erica, I was glad to see you, who's also in the School of Foreign Service, recently came to meet with me because she was so stunned to learn that 3rd century BCE Chinese thinkers were the first to make state of nature arguments and to articulate all 3 of the standard concerns one finds in modern just war traditions. They were also among the first thinkers in the world to argue that rulers and states exist to serve their people, and that the proper aim of a good state is the welfare of its people, including the order, security, wealth, happiness, and education its people enjoy. My student came to see me because although she's a senior in the SFS and has taken the required social and political thought course, she had never been exposed to any Asian views on these issues. So, one place where we as educators need to do more is in faculty hiring, the curriculum, and the classroom to ensure that students learn about these ideas from different parts of the world, especially if they're in a program such as the School of Foreign Service. And at conferences like this, too, we need to do better at recognizing the diversity and richness of different religions in different parts of the world, including different parts of Asia, and their distinct contributions to areas like human rights. And so my final recommendation is that we recognize the genuine limits of religious traditions as resources for helping us to address human rights abuses around the world. For instance, in order to address human rights abuses in China, and there is ample evidence that those against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities in Xinjiang are among the most urgent in the world today, we must work with leaders who possess vast amounts of power, but who are not particularly interested in or influenced by religion. While Xi Jinping appeals to Confucianism when it is useful for his ends, he is far more interested in and influenced by Marxist and legalist ideologies than in any of the religions of East Asia. That is not to say that scholars of religion have no role to play. Since arriving at Georgetown more than 15 years ago, I've spent considerable time at the State Department, especially at the Foreign Service Institute, working to prepare foreign service officers and diplomats for work in and with China and other East Asian countries. Earlier this year, I visited the Pentagon at the invitation of a senior policy advisor for the Secretary of Defense to help DoD policymakers more fully grasp the many different views and resources that are part of the Chinese tradition. But I worry that the difficult work of figuring out how to negotiate with China on human rights abuses has little to do with appealing to Confucian, Taoist, or Buddhist grounds for human dignity or human rights. Instead, it has a lot to do with strategically figuring out how to convince CCP leadership that mass arbitrary arrests and detention, torture, mass surveillance, and cultural and religious persecution undermines the things they most wish to possess: power and prestige. They must come to see, for example, that simply denying the existence and size of the internment camps in Xinjiang is ineffective in a time when we can document their existence through satellite imagery, and that their chance of growing their power and influence rests in part on being trustworthy. This means we must find a way to get them to appreciate the things we value, or attempt to find areas where our concerns overlap. And this is some of the most difficult work that exists. But it is my hope that we can continue to support those who engage in such work by helping them to have a better understanding of the cultures and religions that have shaped, in various ways, the people with whom they must dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for that amazing overview and so many layers of complexity that we'll have time to dig into. Finally, we'd like to welcome Professor Linda Hogan, who is a professor of ecumenics in the School of Religion at Trinity College in Dublin. Thank you for flying all of this way to be with us. We're really grateful for that. Her primary research interests lie in the fields of intercultural and interreligious ethics, social and political ethics, and human rights and gender. She's the author of many books, including Keeping Faith with Human Rights and Feminist Catholic Theological Ethics Conversations in the World Church. So welcome, Linda. We look forward to your remarks.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation and to my panelists for a very engaging conversation so far. In these brief opening remarks and drawing my inspiration from the Catholic tradition, I want to do two things. First of all, to highlight the importance of religious traditions and communities in establishing the cross-cultural resonance of human rights by providing the supporting moral frameworks and visions that inspire and compel communities of solidarity in the work of human rights today. And secondly, I would like to underscore the open, textured, unfinished nature of our understanding of human rights and note the important correctives that religion, and in this case Catholicism, can bring to the neoliberal shift that has occurred in political economy today. So first, to the question of the role of religion in the context of human rights politics. I think we're all aware of that the justifications of human rights have long been contentious, and that this impacts, as we said yesterday, on human rights claims to universality. The UN Declaration, as we know itself, is silent on religion, reflecting what Morsink himself calls a benign secularism, but it creates space for the diverse ways of accounting for the belief that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And we've heard this morning on this panel the many different ways that religious traditions speak about the grounding of human rights. And I'm not going to rehearse them or the manifold other accounts that we find both in politics and in reflection on that. And it's really is my view that it's the plurality of justifications, secular and religious, that both signals and establishes the legitimacy of human rights. We know Maritan's often point during the UNESCO symposium that champions of violently opposed ideologies had agreed on the list of rights on condition that no one asked why. But Maritain went on to note that the goal of the UN Declaration was a practical one, and that agreement could not be reached on the basis of common speculative ideas, but on common practical ideals, not on the affirmation of one and the same conceptualization of the world, of man or knowledge, but on the affirmation of a single body of beliefs for guidance in action. He says, no doubt this is little enough, but it is nonetheless enough to enable a great task to be undertaken. So there was a great deal of confidence and conviction in that. Now, in the 75 years since the promulgation of the UN Declaration, the language of all persons being free and equal in dignity and rights has been mediated, adapted, and renewed precisely because it's been rendered intelligible in the diverse moral languages, particularly religious languages, that express the attachments and capabilities that shape the individual and her sense of flourishing. So we have not seen an epistemic or ontological convergence. Actually, we've seen even more divergence on the foundations, but human rights nonetheless has become a language around which the world's many worldviews, including religious worldviews, cohere. And its strength as a moral framework, I think, derives from its capacity to embrace the diversity of comprehensive doctrines in support of the requirements of human flourishing that are articulated in terms of, as David Hollenbach says, basic needs, core freedoms, and essential relationships. So the universalism, I think, that human rights desires or seeks is not abstract, ahistorical, or context-free, but rather an embedded universalism, understood in the sense of human rights unfolding their critical transformative work within the particularist contingencies of human life and within the particularist traditions. So really, I think of human rights as a dynamic moral language that continues to evolve through inclusive, tradition-thick, not thin, cross-cultural, multi-religious conversations through which we gain a greater understanding of what we owe each other. Of course, for religious persons, human rights are underwritten by our deepest religious convictions. And within the Catholic tradition, one begins from a posture of gratitude for the givenness of human dignity. And it's that givenness of human dignity, I think, that is the basis on which human beings have the capacity for moral reasoning, in a sense, the core of the natural law tradition. But Christianity and Catholicism also has a covenantal structure which imbues all human relationships with a sense of sacrality, so that the inherent dignity we share is a dignity in relation. And in addition to being covenantal, of course, the Christian story is also cruciform, reminding us that we share an ontology that is grounded in our shared vulnerability. And of course, it's true that contemporary politics is directed at denying or fetishizing this vulnerability or dividing people on the basis of the vulnerabilities they experience. But it is, for the Christian tradition and the Catholic tradition, this shared vulnerability, I think, that is lived in a context wherein all kinds of fragments of truth, justice, freedom, gift, threat, failure, forgiveness, reconciliation, all of these are possible. There are other foundational moral categories, obviously solidarity and the common good, that ground the Catholic approach to human rights. But I draw attention to the givenness of human dignity, the relational nature of that dignity, and the shared vulnerability, really, I think, to gesture towards the timbre quality that the Christian faith in its Catholic expression brings to the moral project of human rights. So the moral vision, I think, expressed in these categories, it motivates, inspires, compels individuals and communities of faith. It provides spiritual nourishment for that journey. It forms us in the virtues. It cultivates our moral imaginations so that we can better recognize the exclusions and silences that render so many lives unseen and their losses ungrievable. It also reminds us that our work for justice and human rights is both a protest and a prayer, and that it will always be partial and imperfect, and yet it grounds our hope for a dignified future in a world divided. And each tradition, each religious tradition, has its paradigmatic ways of articulating those visions, the moral vision that inspires and compels the work for human rights. And I think it's vital that we are open to and learn from each other's ways of narrating this inherent dignity. And also important that multi-religious and interreligious engagement will help us, I think, to see the inevitable blind spots in our own particularist traditions, including our religious ones. Let me mention just one or two words briefly about the second point that I haven't time to develop. But that really is about underscoring the open textured nature of human rights, the importance of acknowledging that human rights is a living and evolving tradition. And of course, when we look at the history, we see that very clearly. But I think as we look to the future and the very many intersecting and overlapping global challenges to human rights, I think we see the importance of developing the human rights tradition in particular directions, and especially, I think, in the context of what has been called third generation rights. I know a lot of people really dislike this language of generations of rights, but I think religion has and continues to provide vital resources for a renewal that's focused on these aspects as well. In the case of Catholicism, I think the fundamental contribution is the insistence that the language of rights and the common good are symbiotic and mutually reinforcing. I think we see in the Catholic tradition an instance of rights language within a virtue ethic frame. And in particular, I think this chimes with the emphasis on the indivisibility and interdependence of human rights that we find in political philosophy, where we have really a comprehensive vision of human needs and capabilities in terms of freedom, welfare, and relationships. And within the Catholic tradition, I think we see again the importance of the rights to development, to peace, to our common heritage, to intergenerational equality, to sustainability. These are all rights, I think, that have a common good and communal, community-based orientation as well as an individual one, and they're more and more important in terms of the challenges we face today. So, and in particular, I think Pope Francis, through his insistence on an expansive vision of human dignity rooted in flourishing of persons in community oriented toward the common good, is very important. And Pope Francis enlarged the concept of the common good to include future generations in Laudato Si and also other species. And it again, I think provides us with the kind of inspiration for further development. So human rights are anchored in the recognition, to use David Hollenbach's arresting phrase, that one human being is a kind of ought in the face of another. And this, I think, especially requires a commitment to those human rights that will secure the global public goods of development, peace, intergenerational equity, and environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I think this line of the work is both protest and prayer is going to be something that is going to stay with me for a long time. And I think with that, I wanted to just pick up on two threads that I see, and maybe invite each of you to share a bit what you might have learned from your fellow panelists, or things that you'd like to engage more deeply. The first the kind of thread that struck me was how each of you also have it as an important reference point, not just the theory, but the activism on the ground. And the example of how, people who are living in history and working out the tensions are actually showing us how this is done, and what is the contribution to then a kind of shared patrimony. And so that's one question. I think this work of, rather than going from theory to practice, the dynamic in this work of going from practice to theory in terms of how we're understanding the conversation and our openness to each other. The other thread that I see that you all might also want to pick up on is this kind of core ambivalence, the ways in which some of human rights discourse tends to be reductive in focusing on the individual dimension, and the ways in which religious traditions, speaking grossly and generally, also emphasize this more complex communal dynamic, and how that needs to be welcomed with a great comparative spirit, and we're hoping to also attune our students to that dimension, a critical spirit and a capacity to bring that kind of capacity to comparative spirit into our critical work in this discourse. Those are just two of the threads, in case that's helpful to pick up on each other's work. But I'd just like to open it up and give you each time to comment on what questions you might have for each other, or what your fellow panelists might have provoked in your own thought. So I don't know whoever would like to jump in.
I have a
Yes,
question
go
really
ahead.
for the other panelists, because it's something that I deal with in the context of Muslim societies, and that if you are in a religious community and you have a religious belief and you're interested in human rights, there's always competing interpretations that you're exposed to that draw you in the other direction. And so when you're trying to navigate this terrain, you're always exposed to, well, look, I'm a believer of X tradition, but what is the authentic interpretation that I should be following in order to be a good believer in my tradition? And then how do you push back against and navigate this terrain when there's always these voices that are dragging you in a non-human rights centered orientation? So, so that's the big question, how one sort of navigates these things. This is something that I think is a challenge for people in all different religious traditions, but even in all ideological communities. I can even see sort of people in a communist movement sort of being pulled in different directions between different interpretations of communism that are more rights affirming versus those that are more authoritarian. So the challenge is, how do you navigate? What advice do you give to believers? What's the path to success in terms of advancing a religious-centered interpretation that is rooted in human rights?
If we could solve that this morning, that would be amazing. But I don't know, insights or things that one of us can solve that, right?
I have my own thoughts on how this works out, and how you can advance this. But I was wondering if anyone else in the room also has some thoughts on this.
Yeah. Linda, go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to give a complete answer to that, obviously.
pressure, right?
But I think there are a couple of things. I think it is important that we acknowledge and that we teach our students and those we engage with to acknowledge the diversity that is part of each tradition in its contemporary manifestations, but also historically. I think, and also in that, there is the hermeneutical question that I think it's important that people ask themselves, what is at play in these, particular contestations? Because we often, even when we do teach the history of something, it's often, in a sort of a non-hermeneutical way, asking them to think about what are the powers, what are the interpretations, who's making them, what kind of stake do people have in the interpretations of the tradition that we're dealing with. So it is a complex issue, and my experience is that many people want to shut down that. They actually are seeking this pure, authentic, singular idea of the religious tradition, and that's, at least in my understanding, that's just not available. All religious traditions are, part contestation. And that's about, at least from the Catholic perspective, trying to understand, God's mission, our mission in history. I mean, it's part of what it is to be human, to be part of a community, to have that inherent dignity. There's no escape from it, is what I'd say. And trying to create a context in which that's regarded as a promise rather than a threat. I think that is the challenge.
And it seems that ties in with Aaron's point of the hope to cultivate a capacity through the comparative work and exposure to these different traditions that you can't stay reductive in your drive also for knowledge if you truly open yourself to that dimension. So yeah, I don't know if either of you want to jump in on that, or have other questions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I think one of the things, Eric, I can tell you this too. I'm so glad she's here today. I think it's important to get students to stop, not to think as much in terms of like, this is what this tradition says, but to look for that internal diversity and debate, like you're saying, and then to see, okay, instead of taking views off the shelf and saying this is it, to be discerning and reflective and critical about, okay, these are resources that maybe we can apply in some ways that will be fruitful, right? And maybe they meet up with other resources. But as opposed to seeing it all as black and white, you take it or leave it.
So, three observations in general from what has been raised here. I mean, just something people should be aware of about Judaism. Almost from the very beginning, it didn't believe that there was only one path to salvation or heaven. That so long as as long as people believed in God and were ethical people, they had an equal path to God. So there was never kind of the need to go out and proselytize. The medieval authorities were quite clear that this included Christianity and Islam as well here. And then in the beginning of the Age of Reason, some of the great Orthodox thinkers like Moses Mendelssohn made the argument, you didn't even need to believe in God. What God cared about was not the belief here, but being an ethical person here, et cetera. And that was picked up by the liberal streams of Judaism that developed in the Age of Reason. Secondly, one of the great source of attack on rights today doesn't come from government, it comes from non-state actors. And the status of that within thinking about how human rights law addresses a very challenging, complex kind of issue. But I will say your question about secular authorities like she, and dealing with that. I was very taken by that important question. But when it comes to responding to non-state actors, the growth of interfaith cooperation, of standing up for each other, which is unprecedented in human history. This is a fairly 1.5 century old idea in human history, international cooperation and dialogue. So, I mean, intellectuals may have dialogue through their writings, but not in an organized manner that we know today. And standing up with each other against those threats is absolutely indispensable. Here, in terms of splits within the community, there's no Jewish voice on the next panel here. You know, I'm struck by the two that absolutely divide the Jewish community. One domestic and one international. The domestic one is this incredible tension that divides thinking about these issues in America between religious freedom claims and civil rights claims. And our community is totally split on that. Very sensitive to the civil rights claims, believing in general it is a sufficiently compelling interest to limit religious freedom claims, but really believing that those efforts amongst some liberals to simply, well, let's deny the right to even make the religious freedom claim is wrong. And the other is Israel here, and the enormous split in our community. Overwhelming consensus that Israel is in a survival situation, but these are two cognitive dissonantly survival narratives in tension with each other, and a clear sense amongst growing numbers within our community that what we're witnessing with Israel, that was a just war to fight, is being fought in a way that raises profound human rights concerns we have. And that is an enormous division that's going to haunt the Jewish community for a long time to come.
Thank you, David. And I just wanted to run a highlighter through the incredible, I would say, witness right now of interfaith work. And I've been involved in interfaith dialogue work since I was a teenager, and I have to confess, there have been some recent times where I'm like, does this still have traction? Are people still drawn to this? And we saw on our law campus after October 7th, our Interfaith Advisory Council of religious student group leaders came together, and they said, absolutely, we need this now more than ever. And so this kind of work of just holding space for each other, learning about each other's tradition, growing in that temperament and that capacity now more than ever.
And what we see all across the world dwarfs what has existed and at any other time in human history here. So.
Absolutely, it's a source of hope. So we do have, we have a full 15 minutes for questions, and I think there's a walking mic. Oh my goodness, okay. So if you could make sure that it's a question and also keep it relatively short, and maybe we can take a pepper of a few, but let's start in the back. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nikash Harpanhali. I'm currently a second-year master's student and the Berkley Events Fellow. So if you were handed a pamphlet, say thank you.
Thank you.
My question to you is, amidst the epistemic convergences, divergences, and this constellation of world traditions, I'm curious as to how notions of tolerance, pluralism, and equity inform your tradition's approaches to human rights discourse. And Professor Klein, if you could make a distinction between South Asian and East Asian traditions' approach to how pluralism engages rights discourse, I'd be beyond grateful to hear all of your answers.
Great. Let's take, if we could take 3 questions, and then we can ask the panelists to address them. Yes, in the back there, all the way in the back. Yes.
Thank you for this exciting conversation. It's exciting to me because a lot of my work in recent years has been at a grassroots level, working with Protestant churches and seminary students to develop this sort of richer theological justification for human rights within that tradition. And I'm curious how you might wrestle with the possible tension between empowering people to see the resources in support of human rights in their faith tradition, and also understanding that we engage human rights critically, and to affirm human rights, or many of the human rights that are now part of the legal framework, does not necessarily mean, as religious people, that we are wholesale adopting every position from the UN. And so I wonder, just sort of, how do you address that tension between both developing the affirmation and also continuing to bring a critical approach from within the particular richness of your tradition?
Great, thank you. That's lots of layers to dig into. Let's take one more. Catherine?
Catherine Marshall from the Berkley Center. There's been, I know, a lot of work on a universal declaration of human responsibilities. And with an idea, David mentioned the responsibility versus rights. It's sort of faded, but at the time, the idea was that it was much more compatible with Asian traditions, and that the European traditions, and presumably American, opposed it. But I'm curious as to how you see this, the idea of the Universal Declaration of Responsibilities.
Great questions. Okay, let's have at whatever you would you'd like to pick up on, and then keep in mind we've got several more, so let's keep our responses short. Whoever would like to jump in, feel free.
I'll just jump in, and let me jump in with Catherine with this question. I mean, I think one of the interesting things when it comes to Asian traditions on this issue is that if we want to go back to earlier sources, then it becomes more interesting to think about, yeah, we're not talking about rights, we're talking about responsibilities to others. If we're talking about today, right, then, I mean, we're looking at people who have been influenced by lots of different cultures and traditions. And so, I mean, I think that we have really community-based views of human rights that we've talked about that are widely understood. And so I feel like today we're dealing with such a global kind of setting, and especially, I mean, it's like you should take China for example. It's a big mixture of different traditions that make up the culture. So I think it's less of a challenge now to get people to understand rights as opposed to responsibilities. So I have more I think I'm more optimistic about the accessibility of rights for people. The first question, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues. I think the issue of pluralism and tolerance. South Asia versus East Asia. So you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say it depends on which tradition you look at, right? So if you take the Taoist tradition in East Asia, in the text of the Zhuangzi, which my students are getting ready to talk about today, right after this, you find a really interesting account of how there is a mad diversity of good lives that people can lead, right? And he advocates a kind of ethical pluralism in terms of, there isn't just one path to a good life. There are many different kinds of good lives, many different ways that people can flourish. So I think within the Taoist tradition, there's a voice there and a resource that promotes that kind of ethical pluralism, right? With some shared values, right? But affirming that diversity. South Asia, again, I think it's going to depend on what tradition you look at and the incredible diversity within each of those traditions. If you take the Buddhist tradition, you have this again, mad diversity of ways of what it means to be a Buddhist, what it means to practice. And I think Buddhism is the most diverse religious tradition in the world because it's a tradition where you have non-theistic forms today, but you also have, I mean, the majority of Buddhists worldwide are theists, right? And so you have just incredibly diverse forms. Yet at the same time, there are shared texts and practices that all of those Buddhists affirm. It may be a fairly small number of them, but there are shared teachings that they all affirm. So I think there's sort of a lesson that can be taken from the tradition itself and the way that that's enacted within the tradition of Buddhism in particular.
Great. Anyone want to pick up on this holding in kind of creative tension, empowering, and also being inspired by the idealism, while at the same time critical engagement on the limits? Yeah.
Well, let me give some reflections on that. I think in a way, the earlier question about tolerance and pluralism is relevant here, because when we think about how the Catholic tradition has evolved its understanding of tolerance and pluralism, you can see that the religious tradition and the moral tradition itself is also trying to understand its responses to contemporary realities and what is required of us as Christian when we encounter pluralism, and that has changed radically in the last century, and I think it's important, I think, to pay attention to that evolution of religious traditions, as well as the evolution in our understanding of the moral requirements of human rights. So neither is static, neither is singular, and I think that gives us a way of thinking about how they interrelate with each other. And the other point that I would make is that I think as the voices of religiously motivated human rights actors, activists, leaders, communities, I think is vastly under-engaged in contemporary life, and certainly at the formal levels of the UN, etc. Of course, there are important points of intersection and interaction, but I think, when we think about the billions of people who affiliate with religion worldwide, we can see that this really has potential to be an immense source of inspiration, galvanization for human rights, and it really is vastly under-engaged, and a lot of much of our media thinks about religion as inimical to human rights rather than significantly supportive of it, for many of the reasons you were speaking about. So I think that's absolutely vital as we think about those two elements, religion and human rights.
Yeah, very quickly to the first question on tolerance, pluralism, and equity. I think really the details matter here. Talking in abstract terms, everyone claims they support, tolerism, pluralism, and equity, but what about the specifics? So in the case of Muslim societies, the big challenges are, where is the moral standing and the human rights for these minority religion communities that have come after Islam, like the Baha'is in Iran or the Ahmadis in Pakistan? What's your conception of human rights? Where do they stand in your political imagination? So specifics matter. With respect to Catherine's question, I wasn't aware that there was an attempt to have a universal declaration of universal responsibilities. I'm inherently attracted to that idea. I come from Canada, and coming to the United States, one of the things that I still grapple with is why there is so much opposition to something that, to me, based on where I was raised, seems like a fundamental human right, and that's universal health care. I think the problem with the project is the problem of neoliberal economics. States aren't responsible for these types of things. We just have to promote the market, and the market will solve everything, right? So we come up against this predatory capitalist sort of narrative, which unfortunately dominates at least the two political parties in this country, and I think would be very reluctant to have any universal declaration of moral responsibilities. But I think that is, a wonderful project that I'd like to see, move forward. I suspect, the United States at the UN General Assembly would veto it immediately.
If there's time for David's question, I'll pass responding to this.
Yes, if we can get a quick pepper of 3 more questions. David, and David, and great, okay. Lena, great, okay, wonderful.
Thanks very much for this interesting panel. In response to Professor Hashmi's question, how do religious believers deal with internal conflict? It seems to me one reference is the nature of the declaration, the Human Rights Declaration, the context in which it was drafted and developed. It seems to me that's absolutely critical. Cass Sunstein and others have used the term rights from wrongs, and it seems to me that's the best way to describe the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We saw a bunch of wrongs. out there based on the practices of a given government or several governments, and we responded to those wrongs by enumerating a set of rights that not only thwarts those wrongs, but also tries to provide a future context based on an assumption that those things were wrong that will prevent the reoccurrence of that. If you read a book like Johannes Morsink's book, how did we actually get the drafting of the individual? Well, they were in response to Nazi atrocities, each one of them. And that seems to me a very important reference point. And finally, I would suggest that when people respond in that way, they don't say, we all agree that torture is wrong. You must agree that it's wrong. Whether you're a Buddhist, a Christian, a Muslim, you must agree that it's wrong, and you will be held responsible, whatever your religious point of view, for practicing that kind of thing. It seems to me that's a critical context in which to think about how you settle issues. And the denial of the Holocaust, the denial that slavery was wrong, that's the fundamental attack on the human rights project, it seems to me. And we're all called upon, I would have thought, to respond accordingly.
Thank you. That's a very helpful clarification. Okay, we've got a whole entire minute remaining. David, 30 seconds, and Lena, 30 seconds, if that's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a very rich panel. And one of the things that I would love to hear from all four of our panelists about is Linda Hogan quoted Jacques Maritain about we can agree on these human rights as long as no one asks us why. Namely, that there's a kind of practical ability to agree on this. With the richness of the four of your presentations, I'd love to know whether you think that's true. Whether all these different traditions really can agree practically on these rights, as long as we don't ask them to give the rationale for why they do. That's a very interesting question to me. Anyway, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Okay. Well, and last, we're going to give you the last word, Lena.
Thank you. Lena Liederman. It's a question that relates more on the interfaith aspect of human rights, tolerance, pluralism that you alluded about interfaith engagement. And it's a very simple and rather practical question. How in interfaith work do you deal and do you escape the preaching to the choir challenge? I'm affiliated with the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, UK. That's very much about interfaith work and research, and that is a key challenge. How do you actually reach your interfaith outreach work to the communities that actually need it the most? So it kind of relates indirectly to our discussions.
Yes, and so we have the terrible and wonderful conundrum that we're going to have to take all of these questions actually to the break. And so, but it's wonderful to voice them because they can also permeate our work in the next panel and in the ways that we'd like to engage each other over coffee. And so join me in thanking for all of our speakers for this amazing panel.